I think we'll get started. So welcome to anybody that's new. It's lovely to see some new faces here. First time, somebody said hello. Hi, first time. A guitar, there's not a guitar. So Peter, there's not a guitar version, but you can use the flute. The flute edition is essentially concert pitch. So anybody who wants to play along with guitar or piano, it's obviously it's single line melody parts. So join this session. Thanks for doing this. I just bought your early book for you. Oh, thank you, Stephen. That's very kind. Yeah, so today's a little taster session of the new books. There's 3 editions. There's saxophone, clarinet, trumpet, and flute, the flute. But the point about my books, and the same with the first series, the beginner series as well, is they're not really about how to play the instrument. It's really about how to play music. And it really breaks down some sort of key fundamental concepts of improvising. So the first books were the beginner series, which is obviously for people that are new to improvising, and it's based around a blues, and it uses a minor pentatonic scale. And what we often do in that scenario is we'll use one scale across a sequence of chords, and that's something that you can do when you're improvising. What I've done with this new series of books for rhythm, we're covering rhythm changes, which is a real cornerstone. It's a big topic. There's a lot to do, so I had to really think about how I was going to do that. And what I've based it on is what we call chord tone soloing. So this is more for intermediate players. It's assumed that you know the chord symbols. So I'm assuming that you know what the notes of the chord symbols are. And it does cover it in the book, but there's an assumption there that you're familiar with that. So what we're doing is we're essentially trying to outline the harmony with our improvising, and this is a very much approach from pretty much from bebop through modern jazz to modern times, and there's some other sort of concepts in there as well. But essentially, so what we're not doing is we're not playing one scale across a whole bunch of chords, yeah. So this is using the chord tones, the notes of the chords, to build our melodies. And then of course there's some techniques how we can embellish those chord tones to get some chromaticism in there and some kind of authentic jazz language. So what we're doing is we're arpeggiating the chords a lot, and as I said, this is kind of like the approach from Parker sort of kind of forward, really. Yeah, so let's jump right in. So one of the confusing things about rhythm changes is that there's many different variations on it. So I try to cover some of the kind of core main things that you'll come across. There's quite a few chord substitutions that we use, which are covered in the book. I don't want to get too much into harmony today because we can get a bit bogged down with that, because I want us to play. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump right in. And the very first, the most important thing when you need to understand is the form. Okay, so we're working with an AABA form, and that explains about, it starts by explaining what are rhythm changes, how it came about, and what has become evolved as the standard form. Because the original tune "I Got Rhythm" by George Gershwin is not 32 bars; it has a tag. So generally speaking, we don't play the tag. So generally, when you talk about rhythm changes, you're talking about 32-bar AABA form. And of course, there are many, many, many contrafacts that are written on this now, a lot of which are listed in the book as well. So one of the things I like to do is really get to understand the sound. So before you do anything, I think it's really important to be able to recognize the sound of the chord sequence. And there's a couple of little things there's some real kind of key moments. And of course, one of the most important things is hearing the bridge. Okay, so we're just going to listen through once around the sequence. And I've provided all these tracks are in the book. And the idea is you need to kind of just get familiar with this and put this on. So we're going to start with so we get this little turnaround, 1, 6, 2, 5. And then we get this little, hear that? Then we get a little turnaround. So now we're on the second A, repeats. Now this little phrase here. Yeah, so now we get the bridge. You hear that? That's a real key moment there, when you hear that D7 chord. And then we come back to the last A section. The turn around, and again, turn around. Now we get this little, and then turn around. So if we look at this chord sequence here, what you'll see is there's a lot of repetition, and a lot of understanding harmony is really about seeing patterns within the chord sequences. So very briefly, we get if we take the first two bars, we've got this common chord progression here, 1, 6, 2, 5. This is the diatonic version, and what I've set out is essentially I've kind of based the book on this version of rhythm changes as our kind of standard version, and then from that we're going to get the alternative chord sequences. So we're kind of starting with this and establishing this as our kind of regular kind of rhythm changes. So we've got 1, 6, 2, 5. The next two bars are the same. Bars 5 and 6 feature this little kind of chromatic, a few chromatic chords. We've got the diminished chord in there. We've got an inversion. We'll come to that in a minute. That should sort of, it's just really at the moment, I wanted just to get used to hearing those little bits. Bars 7 and 8 are the same as the first two. The reason for that is it's coming back again to the second A. Okay, so when we get the second A, so we get bars 9 and 10, 11 and 12, everything's the same as the first line. We get the repeat of this little kind of walk up phrase there. And if we look at the end of the second A, we get a slightly different chord sequence. And essentially what happens is the chords resolve. We get chord 1, 5, 1. Okay, and so we've resolved back to the tonic there at the end of the last A section. And that's because we're now launching off into a whole new key center. So when you get that chord at the beginning of the B section, this is we're into chromatic harmony now. And we go through this cycles around, then it gets back to the last A. Okay, and then the end of the last A loops back to the beginning of the first A again. Okay, so there's a couple of key moments we've got to be aware of. So that's all outlined in the book. What we're going to do now is, then what I do is essentially I break that down. We're going to go through it like 2 bars at a time. And we're going to look at learning how to improvise on that, really doing a lot of drilling of the chord tones so that we can really get some fluency on here. So the very first exercises that we do, we start very simple. And what we do is we just take those first 2 bars and we loop that around. Okay, we loop around. And what we do is we just play the chord tones. So we start with just roots. And then we add some anticipation. And this is quite a common feature in jazz. Okay, so the first thing we're looking at is playing just simple chord tones. We're playing quarter notes, crotchets. And we're going to add a little anticipation, or sometimes that's called a push. So where you anticipate the next chord by an 8th note. We use the roots, then we use the roots and the fifths, then we use the roots, the thirds and the fifths, and then we finally use the roots, the thirds, the fifths and the sevenths. So for each chord, we've got 4 possible notes. And this is where we're going to jump in now, okay? So we're going to start with example 2I. And what we're doing here is we're doing what I refer to in the book as we're finding a pathway through the chord sequence. And what you'll see throughout the book, all the notes under the notes have numbers, and the numbers relate to the chord symbol above it. And this is where sometimes people get confused, because the numbers do not relate to the key signature. They always refer to the chord. So if we look at 2I, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a 5th degree of this chord to the 6th, go to the, and then that note is now the flat 7 of the G minor 7. So essentially, we're using any of the chord tones, but because we're playing quarter notes, we can only play 2 of them. We're getting 2 notes per chord, but we've got 4 notes to choose from. And what that essentially does, it gives us a nice, pretty kind of flat line. in earlier on, when we're just using the roots and fifths, we're jumping a lot, but the intervals get smaller. We get more of a sort of smoother line by opening up the chords. So we'll just play through that. Okay, we've got 2 bars in, 2 bars count. Let's play example 2I. And we'll go 4 times around. What I'm trying to do is essentially just learn that pathway. Of course, there are many, many possible options there. Now, that doesn't sound much like jazz. So, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some rhythmic phrasing to that. And this is where I talk about anticipating. So this is a really simple way to create some swing feel to it. So all I do is I'll anticipate some of those notes by an 8th note. Okay, and what we'll get is then example 2J. So let's try to play that. And we're swinging these 8th notes. And then the rhythm section keep going, so now you can improvise your own phrasing. And the idea, let's go back again. So you can start making up your own rhythms now based on that pathway. So I might go. Do you see what I'm doing? I'm freeing up the rhythm, and straight away that sounds much more effective. You know, so instead of just being a simple exercise. Okay, so that's the. Then there's a few more exercises around that. We work on some different pathways, and then all we're going to do is in the next example we're going to join 2 of those together, because if now we're essentially dealing with the first 4 bars of the A section. Okay, so it might be worth keeping example 1A. It might be worth keeping that out to one side, because that's essentially the whole sequence. And I think it's really good, like when we're working. So what we're doing is we're kind of zooming in now into like individual bits of that, and working around, and then what we're going to do, we're going to bolt it all together. So it's good to kind of know what we're doing, where it relates to what we're doing. So example 2K is just, you know, just repeating that same exercise of 2J. So now we're getting a 4-bar phrase, and of course we've got more variations and more options. So this is just, so we've just got a sample here of what we could do with 2K. So let's try and play 2K. Yeah. So this is really just to give you an idea, a sample of what you can do. But of course, the idea is that you improvise your own ideas around that. So all we're doing is we're using just the chord tones. Every chord, we're not using any extensions. So we're using the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th of every chord, which means for every chord we have a choice of 4 notes. But because we're playing quarter notes, we're only going to play 2 out of those 4. But we could pick any of the 4, yeah. And then we're applying some rhythmic phrasing to just make it sound a little more like jazz, and we can improvise the rhythm. So let's try 2L. Now, and this is another sample. So I'm playing the same chord sequence, but just and using the same exercise, but just a different outcome now. So example 2L. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, and the idea is, of course, this is limitless. You could just go round and round forever, constantly reinventing that and not repeating yourself. And I would suggest you spend a lot of time on that. It's a really useful exercise. Okay, are we all good? Yeah. So the next step now is, so that's kind of a real gentle kind of way into it. It's getting this concept of really establishing what the chord tones are and just getting some fluency with that, so that we, you know, again, a lot of this stuff, the theory is one thing, but when you come to do it and playing in real time with a track, it means you have to be able to process that information in real time. And I think that's a really useful way to do that. So then the next step, what we're going to do is we're going to double the rhythm. So we're going to start using eighth notes now. And of course, what that means is we've got a choice of, we can play 4 notes per chord instead of 2 notes per chord, what we were doing before. So we could play all 4 of the chord tones, or we could repeat some. So and now, of course, you know, this is like compound multiplication. So the number of possible pathways through this chord sequence, suddenly it just opens up into lots of possible outcomes. Okay, so so we've jumped, now we've skipped ahead a little bit in the book here. So one of the things that it is what you can do is you can start. Have we? No, we haven't. Sorry, forget that. We might have skipped a couple, not too much. So the idea is yes, we have skipped a couple. So in the book, it starts with playing the chord tones from root, going up from the root, which is kind of how a lot of people practice. So when you practice your chord tones, you tend to practice root, 5th, 3rd, 5th, 7th. Well, I always think it's also good to go down 7th, 5th, 3rd root. But I think what's great about this exercise is that we're doing them in any sequence, in any order. And I think that's a really important thing to practice. So not just practicing always your arpeggios up from the root. You know, I think this is, so the idea is we're freer. We're creating these pathways through the chord, starting on any chord tone, going to any other chord tone, sometimes repeating them. We don't have to play every chord. So let's play example 2-0. And of course, we've got to think a little bit quicker now as well, because everything's going twice as fast. So again, I've just written out, this is just one example of what you can do. Okay, so it goes a bit quick. So you get the idea there. So we're just, can you see, for instance, the last one is the 5th, the 3rd, the 3rd, the 5th, and the flat 7th. So I don't use the root. I don't have to use always every chord tone. I have a choice of 4 notes for every chord. Yeah. Let's try another. So again, like practicing these pathways is a really good idea. 2P, it's the exact same exercise, just an alternative pathway. Okay. Okay, and what you could do is just put on a little loop round and round and just practice working on endless pathway, just working around those chords, finding as many pathways as you can. Now, here's the thing that is something that I did from my first book, which I call painting by numbers. So what I do then is we're going to take these arpeggio pathways and we're going to apply some stock rhythms to them. So we've got a couple of examples. Again, you can make up your own rhythms. So what we're going to do we're just going to think of a rhythmic phrase. We're just going to play some rhythm. So 2Q is, we're going to clap 2Q and we're going to clap the rhythm and just learn that rhythm so it goes around 4 times. So it's actually the same thing twice. Ba-da, da ba da da da, ba-da, da ba da da da, ba-da, da ba da da da. Okay, and then let's do the next one as well. Sorry, I've got that on loop. The next example gives you 2R is an alternative rhythm. So one of the things I think is important about rhythms like this is to think, when you hear a rhythm, what you want to be doing is not thinking of the separate notes. Okay, you need to really try and mentally process it as a whole complete unit, certainly one whole bar at a time. And I often refer to this like when you read words, you don't read one letter at a time. You read the whole word and your brain processes it as one complete unit. And I think you need to do that with rhythm. Okay, so each bar is like one word. And I think the problem with reading notation, reading rhythms, is that we get a bit too focused on each separate note, and we're trying to think of the maths and all that. And so I think hearing it's really important. So let's try 2R. So it's just as another alternative option, 2R. Okay, so it's very simple process now. This is my painting by numbers. So if we look at example 2S, and you go back, if you what we've got is we've got the arpeggio, we've got the notes, the pitch from example 2O, and we've got the rhythm from 2Q. So we've literally just stuck them together. Okay, so very, very you know, prescriptive at this point. And it's fine. And don't worry, you know, these are not going to generate the most amazing melodies. It's fine. This is just an exercise. You know, we're in the gym doing some press ups basically. So what we've got is we've got the rhythm from 2Q and the pitch from 2O. So again, that's that thing about getting the fluency of these pathways. Once you're not really thinking about what notes you're playing, then you can think about the rhythmic phrasing. I think that's when it starts. And what we're essentially doing is we're turning what is an arpeggio exercise into a melodic phrase, into melodies. Okay, so here we go, 2S. Let's have a little play on that and we'll see what that sounds like. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, sorry, fluffed that side. Try that once more. 1, 2, 3, 4. We get that little kind of note on the end, but if you were to loop that, and obviously that would join on to the next phrase. That makes sense. So the next one, 2T, is simply all we've done now is we're taking the notes, the pitch from 2P, and we're taking the rhythm from 2R, and we're joining them together, and we're getting this painting by numbers 2T, and this gives us 2T. Okay, so it's exactly the same process, just slightly different outcome. And we end up with these kind of quite angular phrases, a lot of arpeggios, which was actually very common from the bebop era, where they worked on these the chord tones give you these kind of you know, a lot more intervals, a lot more leaps. And I think this is quite interesting because when you use the scale, the chord tone, the chord scale kind of Aebersold approach, nothing wrong with that, but where you have a whole scale for each chord, or if you're using one scale across a series of chords, if you're thinking in scales, you tend to end up with a lot of stepwise movement. So you tend to play up and down the scale, moving to the next nearest note. And so you end up with these quite flat melodic shapes. And when you're playing chord tones like this and arpeggios, you tend to end up with these nice, a bit more kind of curves to the line. Okay, so that's a nice simple exercise there. So that's one method. And of course, you can apply that to all the different sections of the tune with all the different chords that are there. So the next part of the book covers a different process, okay, using voice leading, which is another method of playing chord tone soloing, but working through chord symbols. So what we're going to do next is instead of arpeggiating all of the chord, what we're going to do is we're going to play a horizontal line through the chords. So the idea of this next kind of technique is that you pick one of the chord tones and then you move to the next nearest chord tone. And what this does, this gives you this tends to create quite flat lines. They tend to descend, but there's a way around that as well. And this is particularly useful if you've got a lot of chords and some quite, you know, challenging chords, because what you can do is you can actually just memorize one of these horizontal lines, these horizontal pathways, what we call voice leadings through the chord sequence. And then again, you just add some rhythm to that. So as I said, usually we would go to the nearest note, and if the same note's in the next chord, you repeat it. But that can give you some very flat lines. There's another way you can do, which is if you start to incorporate the next nearest note, which is, I've skipped a few now, so we're skipping ahead a little bit. And what you'll see is if you check out, if you go back to example 1A, we're now looking at bars 5 and 6 of the A section. And there's where we've got this little chord sequence. It goes B flat, goes 6, and then we get this inversion. Yeah, we'll get the third in the bass, and then we get go to chord 4, and then we get the diminished chord, and it leads up to there. Yeah, very, very common little sequence in jazz. That you hear that a lot. Yeah, and then it can cycle around or go. It's got another couple of options there. So what I've done now, what that does, that little sequence, it creates this very interesting bass line. So if you just take the root, yeah, that in itself is a voice lead. That's a voice leading. Okay, there's other ones you could do. You could start at the top and go down. Yeah. Yeah. You hear that one quite a lot. So all I'm going to do, so let's just play this voice leading now. So we've skipped a few things in the book. We're on to chapter 3. We're looking at voice leadings, and we're just going to play the root movement of bars 5 to 6. Here we go. Example 3F. Okay, you hear that line? It's like that's a really strong line in itself. And so that would be something you could practice. You could memorize that when you come to 6. Again, remember the numbers underneath relate to the chord above it. And then, of course, all you've got to do is, again, apply some rhythmic phrasing to that. So we've already looked at anticipations that can create a nice sort of more of a swing feel to it. So if we look at example 3G, I'm going to play that same line now, but instead of just as an exercise, I'm going to use some rhythm to kind of turn it into something a bit more melodic. I forgot to add a very important, because I've chopped a few phrases out. So there's something very important here as well, which is another, in the book it works through it a bit more one at a time. Another thing you can do is if you want to embellish that line, just to make it a little bit more interesting, what you can do is if you can add the root to the line as well, the root of each chord, as an alternative note, just to give you to embellish the line. Okay. Now on this particular line, we've got root, third, root, root. So there's not a lot of opportunity to add another root note in there. Yeah. So this is how I end up with this. Hear that? So I'm going 3, 1, 1, 1, 1. But if I was playing a different line, that's another one that's in the book. So here I can. See what I'm doing there? So just having one other alternative can give that a bit of a nice flavour to it. So then what we're going to do next, example 3Q, again, I've skipped ahead a little bit. We're going to bolt together. We're starting to bolt together some of the stuff we've learned. Okay, so now example 3Q, we're going to be playing bars 5 to 8. So again, if you go back to your chords sheet, you'll see from bars 5 to 8, it's the second half of the A section. We're going to start bolting that together. So where we were working in 2-bar phrases, at this point in the book, we start joining things together and we're working in 4-bar phrases now. And this is just literally bolting a couple of those ideas together. Okay, so again, it's just pure chord tones. We haven't added any chromaticism or anything to it yet. We're just using the chord tones. We've got a choice of 4 notes for each chord. And what we've got here is we've got a combination of our voice leading in the first half, and in the second half, It's just the literally chord tones in any, you know, more of an arpeggio practice. So we've got the horizontal line, and then we've got the arpeggios, and we can sort of intermingle these ideas. So by the end of chapter 3, I need to look at the contents here. We've dealt with all of the A section, the first half and the second half of the A sections. Okay, and what you will notice, like I said before, the second half of the second A section is different to the second half of the first and third A sections. So it covers that in the book, and you can apply these same methods on those different chords there. So chapter 4 is where we talk about what I call joining the dots. And so what we're going to do now is we've got 4 different concepts, 4 different techniques to embellish. Essentially what we're doing is we're embellishing our chord tones. So we're now starting to use notes outside of the chords. We're adding some chromaticism, which is really the flavor of jazz. We're starting to use these embellishment notes. And the way we do that is essentially you're always kind of targeting a chord tone. So when we do this, we're always aiming for a chord tone, but we might play another note before we get there. Yeah. So, and essentially joining the dots means what I'm referring to there is how we connect these different chord tones as we move through the sequence. So instead of only playing chord tones now, we're gonna have some other options. Okay, and the first option is chromatic passing notes, which we're not going to do today. These are in the books. So if I go from one chord tone to another chord tone, if they're I can put a semitone in between them. Yeah, as a way of connecting the chord tones. That's a common method. You hear that a lot. Scale tone passing notes. So passing notes are essentially the notes in between the chord tones. So we can have notes from the scale, from the key signature, or we can use chromatic notes, semitones. We can use chromatic approach notes. Now these are quite simple and very common, sound great. So instead of hitting a chord tone straight on, you just play the semitone above or below it, and then you immediately resolve to the chord tone. So this is a very common device. You hear that a lot. And then the last thing in the book, in this sequence, the 4th method, is what we call enclosures, and that's what we're going to look at here. So an enclosure is when you play a note above and below the chord tone and then land on the chord tone. And essentially it's like, I refer to it in the book as like a sandwich, where you've got the chord tone is the filling, and you play either side of it. And what you're essentially doing is you're kind of highlighting, you're featuring that note by playing a note either side and then landing on it. The notes that approach the chord tones, they create tension, and then that tension is resolved when you hit the chord tone. So that tension sort of draws your ear to it, and then of course when you resolve that tension onto a chord tone, you're hitting a nice strong note. Chord tones are all going to sound strong. But the point of all this is, if we, as you've probably can tell from what we've done so far, if you only play chord tones, it can sound a bit bland. Yeah. So essentially what we're doing is, by adding some chromatic notes that are outside of that, we're just adding a little bit of spice, a bit of flavor to it. And this is really where it starts to sound much more like jazz. So if we look at example 4G, what I've got is I'm back to my first 2 bars again, my little turnaround, my four chords. And of course you can apply this all the way through anywhere in the sequence. And I'm doing my arpeggios. So we're building on what we did before. But as I go to the 2nd and the 4th chord, what I've done is I've done an enclosure. So can you see under the notes where it says EA, EB? That's enclosure above, enclosure below. So I've started off the first bit with my 2 chord tones, and now I replace the next 2 notes with my enclosures. Yeah. Yeah. Then I play chord tones. Chord tone, enclosure. Hear that? So I'm still playing all chord tones on arpeggios, but I've just got 2 enclosures in there. I'm enclosing the first note on the on the second chord and the first note on the last chord. And yeah, and this is a very common device. You hear this a lot in jazz. So let's try 4G. So again, I'm only playing eighth notes. It's all eighth note. So again, this is very much an exercise. It's like an extension, and essentially you're embellishing your arpeggios. Yeah, with this. So let's try this now. 4G, example 4G. Yeah, already it starts to sound a little more jazzy, right? With those little enclosures. Let's try that once more. Here we go. Yeah. Now, of course, using my other idea of adding some rhythm to that, what we can do is just simply chop a few out. So rhythm isn't always adding. Sometimes we just take away. So all I've done is, if you look at 4H, I've just chopped out a couple of the notes, and by doing that, I've created a different rhythm, a different rhythmic phrase. Yeah. So let's hear 4H now. Yeah, can you see how I end up with that phrase? And that sounds nice, you know, that's a nice kind of phrase. Yeah, but what we're doing is, like, every note kind of has a reason for being there, essentially. And what I'm trying to do is show you how we end up with these kind of phrases. So so the next part of the book shows you how you can then use these so up to this point, we're always adding it on the end of the arpeggio as we go to the next arpeggio. But of course, you can incorporate these embellishments anywhere within the arpeggio. It doesn't have to be the last note. And so the next example, so 4I, what you've got now is, again, we've extended it to a 4-bar line. And if you look underneath, you'll start to see it starts to get a bit complicated. But essentially, you've got all chord tones. So CPN is chromatic passing note. So what I've done there is, on that C minor 7 chord, I've gone down a semitone from the root to the flat 7 on the second bar. I'm on example 4I now, the second bar. So instead, I'm going from the root to the flat 7, and I put a chromatic passing note in. And then I do it again. Yeah, so we're sort of slipping and sliding now between the chord tones, which Cannibal Adderley did all the time. Check out Cannibal Adderley. Like, this is a really common device of his. Now, if we look at the third bar, we've got an enclosure. We start on an enclosure. So we've got, so I'm targeting that note, the 5th of the chord, but I play an enclosure above, enclosure below. Yeah, and then chord tones. Now, CAN, chromatic approach note. So what I'm doing is I'm targeting the root, the 1 of the. I'm on the last bar now of example 4I. So instead of hitting, I play the semitone below that note. Yeah, and then I do it again. So chromatic approach note to the 3rd. So you can apply a chromatic approach note to any of the chord tones. Yeah, you heard that before. Yeah, so any of the chord tones, I can just play. I can slide up to it from a semitone below, or down to it from a semitone above. And now suddenly this opens up a whole lot of possible melodic kind of lines. You understand? But what I'm really doing is I'm still thinking of the chord tones. My brain is on the chord tones, and the embellishments are just kind of filling in around it. So let's try this line here. How are we doing? 4I. Example 4I. Yeah, and it's really kind of getting some jazz language now, isn't it? But those embellishments to the chord tones really start to open up that whole kind of flavour of jazz. And then again, I've skipped ahead. Now what we get into at this point in the book is we start looking at chord substitutions. So there's some classic. There's essentially 4 chord substitutions that we can use. In chapter 2, I talk about using the major 6 instead of the minor 6. We can substitute chord 3 for chord 1. I'm not going to get into this now because we'll get pinned down with all this harmony, and explains it in the book. We've got diminished chord substitutions, and we've got tritone substitutions. I did a whole video on YouTube on tritone substitutions. If you want to find out about that, it's about 20 minutes. And then of course we can start to combine this. So now we can take our basic chord sequence and actually start to get a lot of variations on the harmony. Okay, so we've covered about how to get variations on the melody, how to create melodic variation, and this part gets into harmonic variations, and this is where you end up with like loads of different versions of rhythm changes. But and it might seem confusing, but there's only a kind of few things. Like I said, there's like 4 chord substitutions in the book, and once you realize what's going on, it becomes very easy then to take sort of pretty much any rhythm changes and go, oh yeah, that's just that with a so-and-so there. And this is the kind of language that jazz musicians talk about a lot. And then and then chapter 6, we're basically improvising over the whole A section. So now we're really bolting things together. So I've just got this one example now. So example 6B, what we're doing here is we're playing the whole of the first A section, all right? And we're combining some of our things that we've learned. We've got chord tone soloing, we've got embellishments, chromatic passing notes, enclosures, and then bars 5 and 6, we're using that voice leading exercise that we've done. And then 7 and 8 is the turnaround again. So this is telling me this A section is the first or the last A section, because the second A section has a different chords on the last 2 bars, okay? So, and again, that's covered in the book. Every version of everything is covered in the book. I'm just kind of dipping in now. Okay, so let's try example 6B. Okay, so hopefully you can see how some of those kind of concepts start fitting together to generate. Everything starts. We're just working on bigger structures now. So the time's whizzing past, and we haven't done the bridge yet. So let's just push on to the bridge. So in chapter 7, we cover the bridge. We look at the standard chord sequence here, which is essentially 3, 6, 2, 5. I won't get into that too much now, but there's something very interesting about the chords because they're all the same. They're all dominant 7th chords. There's another device of improvising that I introduce here that's really useful with this, which is essentially what we call sequencing. So and you can do this where you'll play a phrase or a lick and then transpose it around the chords, and so that works particularly well in this situation. And I think this is the key to the book. What you get is quite a few different improvisational techniques, but I think the important thing is understanding when to use them. You can do anything anywhere, but certain methods, certain ideas, certain concepts work better in certain situations. So the context is really important. And of course, the other thing we get into the book is re-harmonizing the bridge, because there's loads of versions of the bridge of rhythm changes. This is the most common version you'll see, but we can add chords to that. We can get chromatic chord sequences, again using the same tritones and diminished chords and things like that we looked at before. And we can also add chord 2 in front of chord 5, so we can create more chords. So it covers a lot of that. But we're just going to look at the basic standard bridge on rhythm changes now. So what I've done here is I've got this. So we're on example 7D. Is this all right? Is everyone keeping up? Sorry. Hang in there. We're nearly there. Right. So example 7D. And what I've done again, so what I think is really important when you're learning is to understand when you're learning something, you need to work on some exercises. And it's that thing of some things you play, it's like, well, that sounds a bit naff, but it's not meant to sound great. It's an exercise. So a good exercise is to take one phrase or motif or whatever you like, or a lick or anything, and then literally transpose it all the way around the sequence. And that's what I've done here in 7D. In the book, we've skipped some stuff. So I start in smaller sequence. So we just start with one bit, then we add to it. So at this point, we're doing the whole of the bridge. We've got 8 bars. And what I'm doing is I'm taking this one phrase. So let's just have a little look at the phrase. I start with an enclosure to the root. I go up to the third, and then I get back to the root, and then I get a chromatic passing note to the flat 7, root, 5th, chromatic approach note to the third. So we should be understanding some of these melodic ideas. Yeah. Yeah, and that's quite a kind of jazzy kind of sounding phrase. And then what I do is, as the chord changes, I transpose that entire phrase up a fourth, because the chord's gone up a fourth. And the reason that works is because we've got the same type of chord. All the chords here, they're all dominant 7th chords. So whatever I play on that first dominant 7th chord, I can play on all the other dominant 7th chords exactly the same. And I just transpose it. And again, this is where the numbers systems really help, because I'm thinking of the chord. So all the numbers relate to the chord. So when I change the chord, the numbers are the same. It's the same numbers. It's just I have to transpose everything. So now it becomes... Oh, yeah. And then we take it around again. And as I'm playing it, I'm thinking of the numbers. So I'm thinking root 3rd, down to the flat 7, root, yeah, flat chromatic up to the 3rd. So that helps me think in the keys, is the numbers are really important. So let's try that with a track. So we've got it in time now. So here we go. So we're just literally transposing. Doing, I've taken the exact same idea. Now, of course, you probably wouldn't want to do that on a solo, but what you could do then, using that as a basis, very simply, just some minor adjustments, and this is what's going to make it sound great and you can do this in real time. So now, example 7C, what I've done is I've changed the rhythm slightly. I've just added a few passing notes here and there, but I'm still using the same idea. And this works really well because I'm taking one idea and I'm sequencing it through the chords. This is what they call sequencing. And it's very effective. When you repeat your ideas when you're soloing, it builds sort of intensity. It really shows a command of what you're doing. And it makes you sound like you know what you're doing. You know, can you repeat your idea? And you're not, well, this thing I talk about a lot is what we're not doing is wiggling our fingers and seeing what comes out the end of the horn, right? We're actually playing something that we intended to play because we're repeating it again. But now we're altering the pitches to fit the new chord sequence, yeah? And then we're just adjusting the rhythms just to make it a little more kind of musical sounding. So again, here's an example, 7E now. And let's have a little look at that. So see how we do this with the adjustments. And there's a mistake. I've spotted a printing error. Isn't that blooming marvelous, right? So there's on the C7 on bar 5, the last note on bar 5, that should be B flat. I don't know if it's in all your editions, but the concert pitch, I'll have to speak to the publisher to see if we can get that flat added in. Get the idea, yeah? So it's just simply, you can hear that I'm using the same idea through the sequence, but but I'm just adjusting the rhythm. I'm just, you know, adding a couple of notes, taking a couple of notes away, and then suddenly it sounds much more musical. It sounds more organic. Yeah. And this is the sort of thing you can do on the fly. Right, fantastic. So finally, what we do is in the book, then of course we bring the whole thing together. We work on the sequence, and I've got a couple of sample solos. We'd also talk about how to get some shape into your solos. So one of the things you can do is this idea of starting very low on your instrument and going up higher to build some intensity, repeating your ideas, and there's a lot of ideas in how to sort of structure and shape your solo to get a nice shape to it, and then it ends up with, as I said, there's 4 compositions. So I've got this. I thought we'd have a play of this Calypso. So this is a tune I wrote, and it's based on. Well, it's not based on, but it's a kind of inspired by or a nod to the Blue Mitchell tune, Fungi Mama. I don't know if you know that. It's a Blue Mitchell rhythm changes. So yeah, do you want to have a go? Now, of course, if you've just done this, then this is going to be quite a challenge. But if you've got the book, I thought we could just have a little play through this to finish up with, and then we'll do a Q&A. So maybe I'll play along with you for a chorus. So we've got the head, we've got 3 choruses, and then we've got the head to finish. And this parts, as I said, these are all free. These are on my website. You can download these, and the backing tracks are on my website as well. So I've got full band parts. There's drums, there's bass, there's piano, guitar, everything. So you could get together with some friends and play these tunes. Okay, so here we go. I'll play over the first chorus with you, and then I'll get out of the way so you can have a little noodle on the next couple of choruses. Here we go then. Second A. Now the bridge. Thirds are really good there. Last A. Back to the top. Okay, fantastic. Yeah. So it's a bit quick, And obviously, you know, if you've just joined, I mean, that's too much. That's way too much to deal with in one go. So it's the book. I mean, the book's going to take some time to work through, but it really does work through things very smallly, piece by piece, and then the idea of bolting it all together over time. And then the tunes, there's a kind of a bebop one. There's one based on the I got rhythm kind of phrase, more of a straightforward swing. And then there's one that's a bit more like Christopher Columbus, and it's like, and there's some different chord sequences as well there. Oh, I forgot to say that bars 5 and 6. So basically, the bars 5 and 6, there's like 3 different versions of that. And then bars 7 and 8, you've got 2 different versions of in the A section. So there's quite a lot of possible variations, combinations of these. And then when you start adding the substitutions, you start to see the many possible outcomes. And I think what it's trying to do with this book is to really understand like the core basic building blocks of rhythm changes. And I think the thing is, if you really get that together and you work on those separately and just get and the key is fluency, because one of the other problems with rhythm changes, everyone plays it so blooming fast, right? It's quite macho sort of thing, you know, unfortunately. So one step, you know, there are stages to learning. And the first stage is kind of understanding and dealing with that theory. And then the second stage is where you need to do some exercises, you know, to work through these and develop the fluency, because what you really need to automate a lot of things to be able to do this. Yeah. So you can't be thinking, oh, what's the third on a G minor 7? Because it's gone like that, you know. So what the book gives you is it gives you a lot of these kind of routines and practices and ways of really embedding that. And the great thing about rhythm changes is 9 times out of 10 it's going to be in B flat. Sometimes it's in E flat, sometimes it's in C, but it's nearly always usually in B flat. So like if you really do that work, that's going to stand you in good. And there's hundreds of tunes based on rhythm changes. So if you go to a jam session, you might not know the tune, but you can still take a solo, right? Because you can just play on the chord sequence. And like I said, there's loads of variations on the chord sequence, but they're all based around just a few core kind of versions. And I think once you really see that and understand that, it basically unlocks everything. Yeah. And so you're not starting from scratch every time you want to learn a new tune. Yeah. And so suddenly it unlocks and opens up all this repertoire. There's a ton of repertoire on rhythm changes, and it's all based on like this same kind of few ingredients. So the thing is to get the fluency on that, and that takes time. There's no shortcuts. I'm not trying to sell you know, snake oil here. You know, it's you still got to do the work. But what I'm trying to give you is a process of how to do that work, and how to assimilate that information, and how to develop that fluency. And then what happens is, as you get more fluency with these blocks, you start to batch process. So you can step back a little, and what you start to do is you're thinking in blocks of music, and that's the key to it. Your brain is processing whole sections of music as one, because you've done that work, you've got that fluency. And that's how jazz musicians play fast and play on rhythm changes. They're not thinking of all them individual chords. They've done that work separately. They've automated that. And they're just thinking in whole chunks of music. Yeah. They're thinking literally like 8 bars at a time. But it takes time to do that. So thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and that maybe you learned something. And I'm always available if you want to drop me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions. That I'm going to stick around. So if anyone's got any questions, I'm sorry it went on a little bit, but I'm going to put this. I've recorded this, so I'm going to put this video up on my website as well for free, so anybody can come along afterwards, and you can perhaps go back over this and, you know, pause it as you go along. That might help. So do feel free to leave if you need to go.
Buster?
Laurie.
Yeah, can I just say to everybody, could they join me in a chorus of happy birthday, because it's Buster's
Ah,
birthday tomorrow?
tomorrow,
Okay.
yeah. Oh, thank you. Fantastic. And I'm going to see Atty on Sunday. Atty is my little nephew. He's hilarious. And the other one, Seren's Serenade in the book, and Bowie's Bounce. Seren and Bowie and Atty all coming to see me on Sunday. And Jo is my wife, in case you wonder who Jo is. So, yeah, that's who the tunes are named after. So if anyone got any questions, do you want to just feel free to just unmute and pipe up? Jo, hello, Jo.
Can I ask a question? I haven't got very far in the book yet. I'm still sort of like in section 2.
Yeah.
What I find what I'm doing, I'm just reading the notes.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Should I be sort of like coming away from like the
Yes.
notes
Definitely.
and doing like my own chord in C or G or whatever?
I think the key is to thinking of the numbers. Use the numbers. So as you're playing, what you've got to try and do is as you're playing the chord tones, you've got to think of the chords. So you've got to really develop that. So you're by using the numbers, you're thinking in harmony. Yeah. And the idea is that if you're just, because some people are good at sight reading, if they're new to jazz, they're not used to this. So it does take an adjustment in your thinking. But essentially, when you're playing jazz, what you've got to be doing is thinking in harmony, thinking of the chords, and the numbers help with that. And then what that does, that unlocks your choices. And again, it's a fluency thing. It's just getting the fluency, and it will take a little while. But I think if going through these exercises, if you just take those first 2 bars, and you could spend a week just going around that, and that's fine, because once you've got it, you've got it. That's not going to change. That's going to be you're going to have learned that, right? And so what you need to so a lot of the exercises, some of the exercises are doing the arpeggios, but where I've written out some phrases, what those are samples. Those are sample lines, just to show you, explain how it works. So yeah, do play the exercise, the written parts, the written lines, but it's very much encouraged that you then create your own parts and improvise with that as well, along every step of the way. So basically, right from the very first exercise, it says in the book, this is just a sample. You should, with all those arpeggio pathways, you should be trying to make up your own pathways as you go along, and until you can kind of do that on the fly. And it takes time. Does that answer your question? Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
Yeah, that's
So they're all samples. Everything in there is just one example. The idea is that then you can make up your own stuff. Anybody got any questions?
Yeah,
Oliver, hello, Oliver.
Yeah, great book. Thank you. Really good message. But I had a question about the B section, the dominant chords.
Yes.
Is one assuming they're all Mixolydian, or might they be from other
yes,
modes?
Mixolydian would be the first choice if you were using a scale or a mode. But what we're trying to do here with the chord tone soloing approach is a different approach to that. So so again, using a scale chord method, Mixolydian would be your first choice there. But what I find is if you're thinking Mixolydian mode, you tend to be, it's a very natural thing to be playing very stepwise motion. If you're playing the whole, and also that's a whole lot of notes. You've got 7 notes there, whereas I'm only using 4. So you got more to process. You see what I mean? So when you're using the chord tones, you're going to get more leaps, more angular phrases. Your melodic shapes will have more highs and lows. The curves will be a little, and again, it's just a different approach. The beboppers were thinking chords like arpeggios. They use a lot of arpeggios, so you end up with that kind of types of phrases, that kind of melodic shapes, and that kind of language. So it's not wrong. It's just different. It's just a different thing.
No, I mean the clever thing is that obviously the chord tones work for any mode, don't they?
But exactly. Yeah. So if you
were analysing, do those dominant sevenths belong to different keys, or are they all?
I'm always thinking I'm starting from scratch on every chord. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So every time I get a new chord, like one is the chord, it relates to the chord, not the key signature. Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, if you're using chord tones, they're all strong notes. They're all gonna sound strong. And of course, the other thing is this is what they call making the changes. You know, well, I forgot to say that. Like, so when you're improvising, you're going to be really outlining the harmony in your solo. It's going to give your solo real clarity by using chord tones. It's not good and bad, right or wrong. It's just it will have a certain sound to it if you're using chord tones. It's just one particular method that has a particular, result, I suppose.
Right, thanks.
I mean, ultimately, we're going to be using a mix of all these things, aren't we? Yeah. So, but I think I think we have to, when we're studying, we have to think differently to when we're performing. So the idea is when we study and we're learning, we're trying to really isolate things. We're trying to do things in it's like a science lab, under controlled controlled experiment, like within very tight parameters. And when you work in that way, it really develops your control over what you're doing, and your skills. And then, of course, when we improvise and we play, we kind of forget all that and play freely. That's kind of the goal. But that's assuming that you've done that work and that you've already automated a lot of things. Because no one can think of all them chord tones at that speed. You've got this is what they call, the woodshedding. When you go out to the woodshed and you've got to put that time in, just going round and round and round and round and round and round these sequences and embedding those patterns and shapes and chord tones under your fingers until it becomes totally fluent. And then what happens is when you're improvising, you're automatically, subconsciously, you're being drawn to those notes. So that when you're improvising, you're playing with the rhythm, you're playing phrases, you're automatically hitting those chord tones because you've bedded that in. That's the plan. Yeah. Great. Anybody got any comments? Any questions? Any observations? Anything they?
Yeah, I'll give a comment. I thought this was absolutely brilliant. I actually joined because I got your other book just a few weeks ago by coincidence. I just caught this on the web at the weekend,
fantastic.
And I thought, like, next year I'll look at his second book. But I was surprised how much I was able to follow along, and just the way you broke things down.
Yeah,
I thought it was just genius.
That's very kind.
absolutely brilliant. I mean, I played in a big band for years, and I never really got the hang of this improvising at all. But actually, maybe I'll get some of this now. I'm quite astounded. Actually, I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're learning, it's not just about information, is it? It's about having a process.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think the important thing of teaching is having a process, not just sort of dumping information. It's like, how do I assimilate that information? And of course, breaking it down. I forgot to say, actually, everybody's gone now. I do regular jazz improvisation workshops every fortnight, and the next one's available on my website. We're going to be doing Dark Eyes, and what I normally do is I take a tune, a standard, and I strip it down, and we go through it like that, and we apply that. So this session is slightly different because it's on the book, but normally I do repertoire, basically, and they're all on my website as well. I've recorded all the sessions, so you can get them all the past sessions. There's like 38 videos up there now or something. So yeah, I think the approach to learning is very important. I think it's important to break things down. I think it's important to understand how it works, and then there's obviously there's exercises and things that you can do to develop your skills that will help you. But ultimately, it's up to you how you improvise, and it's always going to come out different, isn't it? But I think that understanding of what you're trying to do, and take it, taking small bites, really, isn't it? Like I said, you could, that first 2 bars, you could spend a week on that, easy. Yeah. So, But it won't be wasted time because it's always there, isn't it? Yeah. Great. Well, yeah, it's nice to see you, Steve. I hope to see you again, and appreciate you coming along. Anybody else before we? Oh, hey, cheers, Max. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Honest to gosh, you know, I've been a teacher a long time, and like I said, I never really had to teach improvisation.
Yeah.
And so I never, and obviously I've had people, okay, yeah, break it down. Here's arpeggios. But you're the first person that, as you were going through it, when I got the, envelope or enclose above, enclose below, and I was listening, I said, my God, why didn't I ever figure this out after? And it seems so logical and so simple, and I missed it completely for 40 years.
Oh.
So thank you. The one thing I do have to tell you, after that first book, you know, I know minor pentatonic scales, and I could run those all day. And my word, you know, I took it up a third and then did the minor from that, and then in the bridge, oh my gosh, that worked too. And I thought, oh, this is good, because I really never thought of the chords. I was thinking all melody, but I noticed that worked. And you used a word. And I'm sorry, did you use a word, and did you say neff?
Oh, sorry, naff. Yeah. So I said it sounds a bit naff. Sorry, that's a British term. It means a bit slightly duff, you know, a bit if something's a bit not very good, we say it's a bit naff, you know.
Gotcha.
And I guess not naff. What was I talking about? Bland. I said it was a bit bland, I think I meant, like, if you
yeah, you used that term naff, and I honestly didn't. I was thinking, what is that? It's something that I obviously don't know, but then again, you haven't heard me speak in Pittsburghese, so you would.
Yeah, right. I'm sure. Yeah, we're what is it? Divided by a common language. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, it's just that thing. I think sometimes when people are wanting to improvise, they get a bit impatient. I want to play some jazz, man, you know, and it's like, well, you've got to work through these processes. And I think, so what we start with is just the chord tones and a process of applying some rhythm, and not worry too much yet about what it sounds like. You know, it's just about the process. So if it does come out a bit naff, you know, like then we're not getting too bothered, because we've not got all the ingredients in place yet. You know, we're just getting the bare bones of it. Then later when we start embellishing those chord tones with the chromaticisms and with the different rhythmic phrases, that's when it really starts to sound much more like music and more like jazz. But in the early stages, I think it's that thing of being aware that this, you know, this isn't the, you know, I often say, like, we're in the gym, you know, we're doing some push-ups and sit-ups. We haven't even got the ball out yet, let alone play the match. You know, it's not, we're not playing the match, you know, on the final tournament day. Every single time we pick the instrument up, we have to appreciate that we spend a certain amount of time just in the gym, just working through things. Don't worry about what it sounds like yet. We're developing a process, and we're automating some things, you know, that we can then build on. I think that's the key to it. Don't expect it to sound like Charlie Parker from page one. And then, of course, understanding why. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this exercise? What is this going to lead to? And I think if you understand that, then you go, oh, right, okay, you can see the value of what you're doing, isn't it? I think that's very important for students as well. Yeah, great.